This seems as good a point in time as any to clarify the question of the inner eye and what I was talking about when I used that metaphor. Recall a discrete visual memory. It doesn't matter what. You find that you are creating in your mind conceptually something that is akin to a visual experience. Now, step away from that memory and think about an abstract concept. Love. Think about mathematics. Think about the sound of one hand clapping. And you find that while you may have lost visual reference, the experience is still much the same. You still find your thought directed and focused in a specific fashion. Now note that this is but one way in which thought can be focused. By way of example, right now, as I am speaking, I do not have a corollary conceptual auditory experience. I am not hearing the words in my head before or even as I say them. But there is still thought, and it is still focused, and it is still directed, although it is operating very differently. Consider further still away from that initial corollary sensory experience. General comprehension, but just turnings of the gears of the mind. This may be very intentional, wherein you are trying to work something out, or it may be something wherein you're allowing it to sit perhaps in the back of the mind, where you're primarily focusing on other things, but still giving some thought to a problem, resolving a memory, a course of action, something along those lines. Now consider a still further step away from that original sense corollary experience, the almost passive operation of the mind, wherein concepts, correlations, and relationships are still being resolved with or without your intentional focus. Now consider that a clear demarcation between any of these, a clear line drawn between them, is either very difficult or flat out impossible, while the formation of spoken language as I am speaking may not consciously operate as a direct corollary to an auditory experience. It still has correlation to an auditory experience, even a virtual auditory experience. So too, the intentional focused processes of the mind are not entirely separate from the general or unfocused or undirected processes of the mind. We have great difficulty in drawing an absolute distinction between any two of these. And we find that in their general operation, they're almost always sympathetic, synergistic. This, incidentally, is one of the problems that I have with the Freudian model, where we would draw clear blocks around these processes and say that here there is this and there is that, and this is never that. Well, I'm generally not a fan of non-contradiction, but in particular to this problem, I think it is a grotesque oversimplification of an astonishingly complex series of questions. Two final points and I will wrap this up. The open system problem, that being the impossibility of actual closed systems, is staggeringly potent in its implications. One of those implications that is well worth considering and is directly applicable to the questions that we're asking here is the ways in which this problem of an open system, or rather open series of systems, can be applied to our question of a bounded infinite. For if we consider that there are no closed systems, then the bounded infinite that we describe as a single choice problem itself is but one finite value within a larger bounded infinite, wherein this particular range of infinities, this particular range of infinities defined by bounds, by virtue of the definition of those bounds in a larger system, it represents a fixed quantity. Each individual selection problem, each bounded infinite, by virtue of those bounds, in the context of a greater bounded infinite, represents but one entry, but one possible selection within that greater bounded infinite. Where it gets interesting and perhaps a little tricky is the question of statistical significance. As all possible selections within a bounded infinite are within bounds, and in a greater system, those bounds are clearly defined, and are but one selection in another bounded infinite, so on, so on, so on, and so forth. We have questions raised about the ultimate impact of a given choice. Now here, the soft determinist, Isaac Asimov, for example, would say that these minor statistical variations work themselves out in the greater equation. But I would say that knowing the significance of the possible range of choice in a given problem, knowing how big of an impact it will ultimately have, requires a few things that are completely beyond us. First, we must know our relative position in this matrix of nested problems. We must know the relative magnitude of the selection problem in which we are currently engaging. This is not ultimately possible. Second, we must have a knowledge of the outcomes generated at a similar tier of nesting in order to understand the possible impact of a selection within the confines of a given bounded infinite. We must understand the other selections that have been made at that degree of nesting to determine whether a selection towards this end of the range or that end of the range will produce a shift in the overall outcome. This also is beyond our knowledge. Third, we must know, in order to say that these little statistic aberrances will work themselves out in the mix, we must know that selection cannot shift order of magnitude. That, for example, choosing a particular selection within our bounded range may shift that selection to a greater or a lesser order of magnitude in its impact on the overall system. That we would essentially move up or down a tree of nested processes based on a given selection. And this begs the question of whether we can choose to do so, whether we can perceive choices that in and of themselves would constitute a shift in order of magnitude or a shift in degree of nesting in this process. Now, with all of these we cannot knows, we do not knows, we will not knows, it may seem that these are thoughts, that these are ideas which do not lend themselves to application. And here I would humbly propose that from philosophy of mind in general, and speaking specifically about what we've been talking about here, we have perhaps a very, very useful functional definition or imperative to compassion. Because with all of these complexities, all of the vagaries, I see you. I regard you. And I recognize the inherent problems involved in that process. But in so doing, I also recognize that I could have been you. And more to the point, I could be more like you than I know. And you could be more like me than you know. An interesting way to go about the problem.